During the transfer process of immovable property, there's always a form of tax payable to the receiver of revenue. And this specific tax can either be value-added tax or transfer duties. And it is imperative to determine what type of tax is applicable during the transaction, as VAT or value-added tax is under normal circumstances, and if the contract doesn't dictate otherwise, included in your selling price, payable by the seller. Whilst transfer duties, on the other hand, is not included in your selling price and is payable by the purchaser, especially in those instances where the seller has an expected anticipation as to the net proceeds that he will put in his pocket out of the transaction. It is of the utmost importance to determine what type of tax applies to your relevant transaction, by default of which the seller might be left out of pocket, only to realize that he did not make provision for the value-added tax, which needs to be subtracted from the selling price. To determine what type of tax is applicable is actually very simple. You just have to ask yourself one question. Is the registered entity in which the property is registered for VAT or a registered VAT vendor? If the answer to that is yes, then VAT will apply, not transfer duties. And if the flip side is true, in that the seller is not a VAT vendor, then transfer duties would apply, not VAT. It is also important to remember that only one type of tax can apply to a transaction. You will not have a situation where transfer duties as well as VAT is applicable simultaneously. But truly important is that you have to make provision for it, and you have to determine the type of tax applicable. And that needs to be done during the marketing or even the listing of the property, so that you don't have a situation where the tax surprises the seller at the end of the day. If the answer is yes, and the seller is a VAT vendor, obviously VAT will apply to the transaction. And one has to verify as to if it is included in your selling price, or if it has to be paid by the purchaser over and above the purchase price. When you have a look at transfer duties being applicable, the transfer duties are leviable in the form of a standard sliding scale determined by the Minister of Finances from time to time. And it can be obtained on our list of costs available from any of our branches, or you can use our cost calculator on our website that you're currently visiting. You do get certain instances where the seller is not a VAT vendor, but the purchaser is. And the question normally arises, what happens then? As we still have to ask ourselves the question as to whether the seller is the VAT vendor, and the answer would be no, the purchaser has to pay transfer duties, but he would be entitled to reclaim the transfer duties as an input cost from SARS. There can also be an instance where the parties are both VAT vendors, and you've probably heard about a possibility of a zero-rated VAT transaction. There's unfortunately a certain requirement in that the property has to be purchased as a going or running concern, and it has to be an income-generating enterprise. And your deed of sale explicitly has to make provision for these two allegations.